The hangman's noose wasn't just rope. It was the distilled judgment of a town without mercy. It smelled of dust and finality. Below the gallows, Naomi May Thompson stood condemned, her only crime a desperate attempt to quiet the gnawing hunger in her 7 children's bellies. For a single loaf of bread, she was to be erased. The town of Redemption Gulch watched their faces a mixture of grim satisfaction and unspoken fear. But as the shadow of the gallows swung across the dirt, a lone rider appeared, a man whose own life was as barren as the land he owned. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless tyrant. It beat down on the cracked earth, baking it into a jigsaw of pale brown fissures. It bleached the life from the wooden storefronts, turning them a ghostly grey, and it shimmered in waves of heat above the single, dusty track that served as Main Street. For Naomi May Thompson, that sun was a final indifferent witness. The gallows was a fresh-cut thing, raw pine bleeding sap that cooked in the heat, the scent mixing with the sweat of the crowd and the foul tang of fear. It had been erected with an almost gleeful efficiency that morning. Justice in Redemption Gulch, it seemed, was as swift as it was severe. Naomi stood on the platform, her wrists bound tight enough to make her fingertips pulse with a numb, tingling ache. The coarse weave of the burlap sack she wore for a dress scratched at her skin. It was a far cry from the calico dresses her David had bought her, back when his laughter filled their small cabin and the mine hadn't yet claimed him. The mine owned by the same man who now stood preening below the gallows, Jedediah Cain. Cain was the proprietor of Cain's Mercantile, the only source of supplies for 100 miles. He was a man whose girth was a testament to the fact that while others in town starved, he feasted. His face, flush with self-importance, was framed by thick mutton chop sideburns. He adjusted his silk vest a gaudy splash of emerald green against the dun-colored world, and nodded curtly to the sheriff. Sheriff Brody was a gaunt, tired man, the silver of his badge the only clean thing about him. He looked at Naomi, and for a fleeting moment she saw not the lawman, but the man who had once shared a drink with her David. Then the moment passed, and his eyes became hard, flat stones. "The prisoner, Naomi May Thompson." Cain's voice boomed, silencing the murmuring crowd. He relished the theater of it. "Brought before the righteous justice of this town for the crime of theft." She put her hands on what was not hers. She took from my very shelves a loaf of my finest bread. A loaf of bread, a day-old loaf hard as a rock that he'd have likely thrown to the hogs by nightfall. Naomi's gaze drifted past him, past the faces of the townsfolk, some hungry, some hateful, some merely curious, to the small sun-beaten hill just beyond the edge of town. On that hill was a cabin, barely more than a shack, and inside 7 reasons for her crime. 7 faces flashed in her mind's eye. Luke, the oldest at 12, trying so hard to be the man of the house, his shoulders already slumped with a burden no boy should carry. Then Sarah, with her mother's eyes quiet and watchful. The twins Mark and Matthew, all knees and elbows and hollow cheeks. Little Hannah, whose cough had kept Naomi awake for 3 nights straight. And the 2 youngest, Caleb and baby Rose, too small to even comprehend the hunger that knotted their bellies. The thought of them made a sob catch in her throat, a dry, ragged sound. She had watched them grow weak, their childish chatter fading to listless silence. She had boiled shoe leather for soup. She had foraged for roots until her fingers were raw. She had begged. Oh, how she had begged Jedediah Cain for credit, just until the next wagon train came through, when there might be work. He had looked at her, his eyes lingering on her form with a greasy appraisal. "Credit has its own price, Naomi," he'd said, his voice a low, suggestive rumble. "A pretty widow like you, surely you have assets to barter." The shame of his offer had burned hotter than the sun. She had slapped his face a sharp crack in the silent store and fled with nothing but his leering laughter chasing her out the door. 2 days later, desperation had driven her back. She had seen the bread sitting on the counter. She'd waited until Cain was distracted by a wealthy prospector, and in a single heart-pounding moment, she had snatched it, tucking it under her thin shawl. She had almost made it. She was 3 steps from the door when Cain's hand clamped down on her shoulder like an iron trap. The trial was a farce. There was no judge, no jury, just Cain standing behind his counter, declaring himself the injured party and the arbiter of justice. Sheriff Brody had simply stood by his face, grim. The sentence was passed in less than 5 minutes. Hanging. A message Cain had declared to any other thieves who might get ideas. A message that his property was sacrosanct. Now on the platform, Naomi closed her eyes, trying to block out the jeering and the heat. She focused on the memory of David's hand in hers. "Be strong, Ellie," he used to say. "You're the strongest person I know." But his strength was gone, buried under 1,000 tons of rock in Cain's poorly maintained mine shaft, and hers had crumbled with it. The sheriff approached her, the hangman's noose in his hand. It was thick and expertly tied. "Any last words, Naomi?" Brody asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Really looked at him. "Tell my children I love them," she said, her voice cracking. "Tell Luke. Tell him he has to be strong now." Brody's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement, and she knew he would. He was a weak man, a man who followed the orders of the powerful, but he was not entirely without a soul. He slipped the noose over her head. The rope was rough and abrasive against her neck. It felt heavy, weighted with the sins of the world. She could smell the hemp, a dry, earthy scent that would be the last thing she ever smelled. She turned her head one last time, looking towards the hill. She imagined she could see Luke standing in the doorway of the cabin, a small, defiant silhouette against the vast, unforgiving landscape. A single tear, hot and defiant, escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "Let this be a lesson," Cain bellowed to the crowd. "The law is the law. There are no exceptions for weakness or sentiment." Sheriff Brody moved to the lever. The mechanism creaked. The crowd held its breath. The world seemed to shrink until it was nothing but the wooden platform, the suffocating heat, and the terrible weight of the rope. Naomi took a final shuddering breath and closed her eyes, waiting for the floor to fall away. "Stop!" The voice was not loud, but it cut through the expectant silence like a razor. It was deep calm, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with wealth or position, but with something older, something inherent. Naomi's eyes snapped open. The entire crowd had turned as one, their faces a sea of confusion. At the edge of the town, where the dusty street bled into the open range, sat a man on a magnificent black horse. The man was as formidable as his mount. He wore simple, functional clothes, dark trousers, a plain cotton shirt, and a well-worn leather vest. A wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow, but there was no mistaking who he was. Silas Blackwood. He owned the Blackwood Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that bordered the town on 3 sides. He was a legend, a ghost, a man who possessed more wealth than all of Redemption Gulch combined, but was never seen within its limits. He was a recluse, a man haunted by his own tragedies, the story of which was only whispered in saloons. They said he was infertile, his line destined to die with him after his wife and only child had perished in childbirth years ago. They said his heart was as barren as his marriage bed. He urged his horse forward, the animal moving with a slow, deliberate grace that was somehow more intimidating than a charge. The crowd parted for him instinctively, a wave receding from a rock. He stopped directly in front of the gallows, his gaze lifting from Cain to the sheriff, and finally to Naomi. From under the shadow of his hat, his eyes met hers. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths she saw not pity, but an unnerving, calculating intensity. "What is the meaning of this intrusion, Blackwood?" Cain blustered, his face reddening in anger. "This is official town business." Silas Blackwood did not look at Cain. His eyes remained fixed on Naomi. He seemed to take in every detail, the tear track on her cheek, the raw fear in her eyes, the humiliating coarseness of her dress, the rope around her neck. "I asked the price for a loaf of bread once, Cain," Silas said, his voice still deceptively calm. "You told me it was 5 cents. He paused, letting the statement hang in the hot, still air. "It seems the price has gone up." He finally turned his gaze to Jedediah Cain, and for the first time Cain seemed to shrink. The rancher's quiet stare held more power than all of Cain's blustering pronouncements. "This woman is a thief," Cain spat. "This woman is a mother." Silas countered, his voice dropping even lower. "And I am buying her debt." He reached into a saddlebag, his movements unhurried, and pulled out a small leather pouch. He tossed it through the air. It landed in the dust at Cain's feet with a heavy metallic clink. "That's $20 gold, Silas said. "That should cover the bread and the cost of this ridiculous piece of lumber. Now, Sheriff, take that rope off her neck." The thud of the leather pouch hitting the dust was a sound louder than any gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. The gold was a foreign object in the dirt, a glint of impossible fortune in a world of lack. Jedediah Cain stared at it, his mouth slightly agape, the righteous fury on his face curdling into something more complex. Greed warring with humiliation. Sheriff Brody, frozen with his hand near the lever, looked from the pouch of gold to Silas Blackwood, then to Cain. He was a man caught between 2 immovable forces. Cain represented the town's loud, blustering authority, the power of commerce and civic control. But Silas Blackwood represented something else entirely. He was the land itself, vast, untamable, and governed by its own inscrutable laws. His power wasn't written in ledgers. It was etched into every canyon and mesa for 100 miles. "This is not a matter of debt, Blackwood." Cain finally managed to sputter his voice, regaining some of its bluster. "This is a matter of law. Of principle, you cannot simply ride in here and buy a person's life. I'm not buying her life," Silas replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He swung a leg over his horse, dismounting with a fluid grace that belied his size. He stood to his full height, and the shadow he cast seemed to swallow Cain whole. "I am paying restitution for her crime. The crime," he added, his stormy eyes sweeping over the crowd, "of feeding her children. Is there a man here who would see a woman hang for that when restitution is offered?" His question was a direct challenge, not just to Cain, but to every person present. He was turning their own supposed morality against them. The crowd shifted their murmurs, taking on a different tone. The initial bloodlust was evaporating under the heat of Silas's logic, replaced by a grudging respect, and for some, a flicker of their own long-buried shame. They all knew of Naomi's plight. They had all turned away. Naomi stood on the platform, the world tilting beneath her. The rope which moments before had been a certainty now felt like a grotesque piece of jewelry. She watched Silas Blackwood, this mythical figure of the plains, as he dismantled her execution with a few calm words and a bag of gold. Why? Why would a man who had nothing to do with her with anyone intervene? She had seen him once before, years ago, riding the perimeter of his land. He had looked right through her, then a man encased in a world of his own making. Now he saw her, and it terrified her more than the hanging. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "The fine is paid. The sentence is commuted. Do your duty." Brodie's eyes darted to Cain, who looked like he was about to explode, but the tide of the crowd had turned. They were looking at Cain differently now. He wasn't a pillar of justice. He was a greedy merchant, demanding a woman's blood for a stale loaf of bread. To refuse the gold would expose his cruelty for all to see. With a deep sigh that seemed to drain the last of the fight from him, Sheriff Brodie nodded. He climbed the few steps onto the gallows, his boots heavy on the wood. He moved behind Naomi, and she flinched as she felt his hands at her neck. But instead of the sickening snap of a lever, she felt the weight lift. He was unfastening the noose. The rope fell away. It coiled on the platform like a dead snake. Naomi's knees buckled, and she gasped, sucking in the hot, dusty air as if it were the sweetest nectar. The raw, chafed skin on her neck stung. She was alive. The realization was so overwhelming, so impossible, that she nearly collapsed. Brodie grabbed her arm to steady her. "It's all right, Naomi," he mumbled, untying the ropes at her wrists. "It's over." She stumbled down the steps, her legs unsteady. The crowd parted for her, now their gazes averted, their faces holding a new mixture of pity and awe. She saw Silas Blackwood, standing by his horse, waiting. He had not taken his eyes off her. Cain, his face purple with rage, scooped the pouch of gold from the dust. "This changes nothing." "Blackwood," he seethed. "She is still a thief. She has no place here. She and her whelps are a blight on this town." Silas turned his head slowly, fixing Cain with a look of pure, cold dismissal. "She is no longer your concern." He walked towards Naomi. As he drew closer, she could see the lines etched on his face, lines of sun and sorrow. He was younger than the legend suggested, perhaps not yet 40, but he carried the weight of a much older man. His eyes, now that the brim of his hat didn't shadow them, were even more unsettling up close. They held a deep, profound emptiness, a void she felt she could fall into forever. "Mrs. Thompson," he said. His voice was softer now, but it still held that unnerving control. "Can you ride?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "Good." He gestured with his head towards his horse. Then he looked past her, his gaze finding Sheriff Brodie. "Her children, where are they?" "In her cabin, up on the hill," Brodie answered, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Without another word, Silas turned and began walking up the street, leading his horse, expecting her to follow. Naomi stood frozen for a second, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. Follow him. What did he want from her? She had been saved from the gallows, but she felt she had just been placed in a different, more uncertain kind of custody. She took a hesitant step, then another. The townsfolk watched her go, whispering amongst themselves. She could feel Cain's hateful glare burning into her back. She kept her eyes fixed on the broad back of the man in front of her, the man who had just paid $20 gold for her. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. A life for a loaf of bread. The transaction felt impossibly skewed. There had to be a catch. There was always a catch. The walk to her cabin was a blur. The sun beat down, but she didn't feel it. Her world had been reduced to the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the dust kicked up by Silas Blackwood's boots. When they reached the shack, the door creaked open before they arrived. Luke stood there, his small face pale and streaked with tears, a broken piece of an axe handle clutched in his hand like a club. Behind him, Sarah and the other children peered out, their eyes wide with fear. "Ma!" Luke cried, his voice breaking with relief. He ran to her, burying his face in her burlap dress. They said they were gonna." "I'm here, my love. I'm here," she whispered, stroking his hair. Her own tears finally beginning to fall. She hugged him tightly, then knelt, gathering the other children as they swarmed her, a tangle of thin arms and tear-stained faces. Their collective relief was a physical thing, a wave of love that almost knocked her over. Silas Blackwood stood back, watching the scene from a respectful distance. He remained silent, a stoic statue against the harsh landscape. The emptiness in his eyes seemed to deepen as he watched the reunion, a flicker of something unreadable. Pain, longing, regret passing through their depths. It was the look of a man staring through a window at a feast while he starved outside. After a few moments, when the children's sobs had subsided to sniffles, he spoke. "Gather your things, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "Whatever you and the children can carry." Naomi looked up at him, her arms still wrapped around her little ones. "Gather our things." "Where are we going?" "To my ranch," he stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Your ranch?" she echoed, bewildered. "But why, I can't pay you back. That gold, I have nothing." "I am not asking for payment," he said, his gaze dropping to the faces of the children huddled around her. "There is food at the ranch, there are beds, there is water that doesn't have to be hauled for a mile. Is that not reason enough? It was and it wasn't. Charity like this didn't exist in Redemption Gulch. A man like Silas Blackwood didn't do things without a reason, a purpose. He had bought her in essence. She was his property now, just as surely as his cattle and his land. The thought sent a chill of fear down her spine that was colder than any winter morning. But then she looked at Hannah's pale face, at the way Caleb's shirt hung on his tiny frame. She felt the desperate grip of their hands. She had no choice. She had been given a reprieve from death, but her children were still sentenced to a slow starvation in this shack. Whatever price this man would eventually demand of her, she would have to pay it. For them. "We don't have much to gather," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Then it won't take you long," he replied. He turned and walked a little ways off, giving them their privacy. He stood with his back to them, looking out over the vast, empty expanse of his own land, which began just beyond the next ridge. He looked like a king surveying a desolate kingdom. Naomi ushered the children inside. The cabin was one room, the air thick with the smell of poverty. There was a single mattress stuffed with straw, a rickety table, and a few wooden crates for chairs. She gathered their few meager possessions, a spare set of ragged clothes for each child, a tarnished silver locket with a miniature portrait of David inside, and a worn-out family Bible. That was it. The entire sum of their worldly goods. As she packed their things into a faded quilt, Luke tugged on her sleeve. "Ma," he whispered, his eyes wide with a boy's fearful intuition. "Who is that man? Why is he taking us?" Naomi paused, her hand resting on the cover of the Bible. She looked at her son, at the fear and confusion in his eyes, and she gave him the only answer she had. "He's the man who saved my life, Luke," she said softly. "Right now, that's all we need to know." She slung the bundle over her shoulder, and holding baby Rose in one arm and Hannah's hand in the other, she led her children out of the cabin and into the blinding sunlight, walking towards the silent, waiting figure of Silas Blackwood. She was leaving one prison behind, but she had a terrible feeling she was walking straight into another. The journey from Redemption Gulch was a silent, surreal procession. Silas placed Sarah and Mark on his magnificent black horse, where they clung to the saddle horn with wide eyes. Naomi walked beside them, carrying baby Rose, while her other children trailed behind a small, dusty flock, leaving the only world they had ever known. The oppressive heat of the town slowly gave way to a landscape that breathed the cracked earth, softening into sparse grassland as the lonely call of a hawk replaced the memory of the crowd's jeers. After an hour, they crested a long ridge. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley, the Blackwood Ranch spread out, and the sight stole Naomi's breath. It was not a ranch, it was a kingdom. A massive 2-story stone house stood like a fortress at its heart, flanked by a sprawling barn stables, a blacksmith's forge and corrals teeming with horses. A creek lined with cottonwood trees snaked through the property, a ribbon of impossible green in the arid landscape. This was the source of Silas Blackwood's power, not the gold in his pouch, but the water in his creek and the grass on his land. He didn't need to boast. His power simply was. As they drew closer, ranch hands paused their work, their weathered faces turning to stare with a mixture of raw curiosity and deference. Silas offered no explanation, his face an unreadable mask, as he led them past the bunkhouse and stables directly to the main house. He dismounted with fluid grace and helped the children down, his large, calloused hands, surprisingly gentle. He led them up the stone steps to the shaded veranda, pushing open an immense wooden door. It swung inward without a sound, revealing a world of shadow and silence. "Go on," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Naomi hesitated. The air flowing from the house was cool, smelling of beeswax, old leather, and a profound, deep-seated sorrow, the scent of a place where time had stopped. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside her children, clinging to her dress like frightened chicks. If the outside was a fortress, the inside was a tomb. A grand staircase swept to a second floor, shrouded in shadow. The furniture was dark and heavy, bearing no signs of life. No clutter, no stray books. The polished floors gleamed like dark water, reflecting the dim light. It was meticulously clean and utterly empty. Over a massive stone fireplace, a single portrait hung, a beautiful, sad-eyed woman holding a swaddled infant. Silas's wife and child, the silent rulers of this empty kingdom. He saw her looking at the portrait, and a flicker of pain crossed his face before being suppressed. "His name was Samuel," he said, his voice flat. "He lived for 2 hours. Mary, my wife, she followed him before sunset." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a well. The scale of his loss was as vast as the house itself. "There's a kitchen through there," he said, his tone shifting abruptly back to command. "And a pump with fresh water. See that the children wash up. I'll have Maria bring you food." He turned and left his boot steps echoing on the polished floor before the oppressive silence swallowed them. Naomi stood frozen, surrounded by her 7 children, feeling smaller and more lost than she had on the gallows. She found the cavernous kitchen. A stout, grey-haired woman with kind, weary eyes soon entered. This was Maria, the housekeeper. She carried a tray laden with a roasted chicken, steaming potatoes, fresh bread, and a pitcher of milk. At the sight and smell of it, the children fell utterly silent, their eyes wide with a desperate reverence. Maria set the food down, her movements efficient. Her eyes lingered on the children with a deep maternal pity that needed no words. She gave Naomi a brief, imperceptible nod, a gesture of solidarity, and then was gone. Naomi's hands trembled as she served the food. The children ate with a desperate intensity, the only sounds those of eating of life being restored. Naomi watched a lump in her throat, so thick she couldn't swallow. She had saved them from starvation, but what was the price of this feast? The answer came after the meal. With the younger children asleep by the cold hearth, Silas returned. He gestured for her to follow him into a book-lined study. A large oak desk dominated the space. He did not offer her a seat, but stood by the window looking out at the fading light. "The children will have rooms upstairs," he began, his voice a low monotone. "Maria will see to them. They will have clothes and an education. I can teach them. They will want for nothing in this house." Naomi waited, her hands clasped tightly. This was the preamble. The bill for their lives was coming due. "I have a proposal for you, Mrs. Thompson," he continued, turning to face her. The last rays of sun behind him cast his face in shadow. "It is a business arrangement. A contract." "A contract," she whispered the word, feeling foreign and cold. "I have provided for your future. In return, I require something." He paused, the silence heavy with her fears. "This house is empty. My name ends with me. My life is for nothing." He took a step closer, and her heart hammered against her ribs. "I want you to stay here," he said, his voice a low, intense command. "You and your children. You will not be my wife in the true sense. The memory of my Mary is all the wife I will ever have." His gaze flickered towards the hall. "You will be the mistress of this house. You will manage the staff, care for the children, and bring the sound of life back into these silent rooms." He stopped directly in front of her. "You will give my life the shape of a family. Allow me to provide, to protect, to build for a generation that is not my blood, but will bear my name. Your children will take the Blackwood name. They will be my heirs. In exchange, you will all be safe and provided for." Naomi stared, speechless. This was the price. Not her body, as she had feared, but her life, her family. He wanted to purchase them whole, to arrange them around the gaping hole in his life like furniture. She would be a mother to her own children, but under his roof, under his name, a widow playing the part of a wife. "You want to adopt my children?" She struggled to say the idea both monstrous and a godsend. "I want to give them a father's protection and inheritance." He clarified, his voice raw, with a pain so deep it was terrifying. "And I want to hear their footsteps on the staircase. I want to hear laughter in the yard. I want to sit at the head of that table and not be alone. That is my price." It was a devil's bargain, born of a devil's grief. He was offering a gilded cage, security, and a future for her children, all in exchange for pretending, for filling the void his dead wife and child had left. She thought of Cain's leering face, the rough feel of the noose, Hannah's rattling cough. She looked at her children, sleeping peacefully, their bellies full. What choice did she have, a life of pretense in this beautiful sad mansion, or certain misery in a shack? "And my role?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "You will be Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "in name only. You will have your own rooms, my respect and my protection. You will never have to fear a man like Jedediah Cain again." He paused, his final words, sealing the terms with chilling finality. "And you will be as alone as I am." He wasn't offering happiness or love, but a shared solitude, a partnership in loneliness. She looked at her chapped hands, thinking of David, and the simple love they had shared. This felt like a betrayal. But her children deserved to live. Slowly she raised her head and met the gaze of the haunted man before her. "I accept your terms," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth, each one a price she was willing to pay. Life on the Blackwood Ranch settled into a rhythm that was as strange as it was serene. For the children, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Like dormant seeds given water after a long drought, they blossomed. The hollows in their cheeks filled out, their listless silence was replaced by the sound of laughter echoing through the vast stone house, a sound that Silas had craved like a dying man craves water. He honored his word with a quiet, almost reverent precision. He remained a distant figure, a sentinel at the edge of their new lives, yet his presence was a constant, solid reassurance. Naomi would see him from a distance, watching as Luke, utterly captivated, learned from the blacksmith how to shape hot iron. She found a beautifully illustrated book of local birds on Sarah's pillow one morning, after he had overheard the girl asking about a hawk circling overhead. He never acknowledged these gifts. They were silent offerings, gestures of a man trying to learn the language of family, after years of speaking only the tongue of grief. One afternoon, Naomi found him in the shade of a cottonwood, teaching 7-year-old Matthew how to whittle a piece of bark. His voice was low and steady as he explained the grain of the wood, the way the knife must move with it, not against it. Matthew, who had been so timid and withdrawn, was utterly absorbed, his face a mask of fierce concentration. The sight sent a sharp, aching pang through Naomi's chest. It was a vision of what should have been, of the life David would have given their sons. Naomi, in turn, slipped into her role as mistress of the house. It was a hollow title for a hollow arrangement. She managed the day-to-day running of the household with Maria, the housekeeper, ensuring the children had meals, clean clothes, and lessons in the book-lined study. She was building the scaffolding of a home, but the space within felt vacant. At night, in her luxurious room at the far end of the hall from Silas's, the silence would press in on her. She would lie awake, clutching the locket with David's portrait, feeling like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Her only solace was a walled garden behind the house, a place that had belonged to Mary Blackwood. It was overgrown, wild with neglect, but Naomi found a sense of purpose there. Tending to the roses and pulling the weeds, she felt a connection to the woman whose life she now inhabited. In the center of the garden, beside a simple stone bench, were 2 graves. One was marked Mary Blackwood, the other heartbreakingly small. Samuel Blackwood. She would often find herself there at dusk, whispering to the woman she'd never known, an apology and a thank you on her lips. Silas found her there one evening as the setting sun bled purple and orange across the sky. He stood by the gate for a long time before speaking. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice rough with an unidentifiable emotion. "I know," she replied softly. "It feels right." He walked over to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the 2 headstones. "She loved this garden," he said, his voice distant. "She said it was the only place the wind didn't sound lonely." It was the most personal thing he had ever shared, and in that moment, the rigid lines of their contract seemed to blur. But while a fragile peace settled over the Blackwood Ranch, a storm of malice was brewing in Redemption Gulch. Jedediah Cain could not stomach his humiliation. The $20 gold Silas had tossed in the dust felt like a brand on his pride. Blackwood hadn't just defied him. He had exposed Cain's cruelty for all to see. The townspeople who had once feared him now looked at him with a thinly veiled contempt. Business at the Mercantile soured. Cain's anger festered, curdling into a venomous obsession. He twisted the narrative, painting Naomi as a conniving harlot who had sold herself and her children to the reclusive rancher. Silas was cast as an old fool, easily manipulated by a woman of loose morals. He began a campaign of whispers in the saloon and suggestive comments in his store. "Strange, isn't it?" he'd say to anyone who would listen. "How quickly that grieving widow found comfort in Blackwood's fortune. 7 children, and now they're all set to inherit the biggest ranch in the territory. Clever woman." The poison spread through the town like a fever. Naomi became a seductress. Silas, a lecherous old man. Sheriff Brody was a prime target for Cain's venom. "You were there, Brody," Cain would hiss. "You saw her on that gallows cold as ice. Now she's living in sin, setting a terrible example. What about those children? The law has a duty to protect their welfare, doesn't it?" The idea of the children being in danger began to gnaw at Brody, who for all his weakness had a soft spot for the young. Cain's masterstroke, however, came from his own dusty ledgers. Fueled by whiskey and resentment one night, he found what he was looking for, an outstanding debt signed for by David Thompson 2 years prior. It was for a significant sum for mining equipment and blasting powder. A triumphant, ugly smile spread across Cain's face. This was the weapon he needed. The theft of the bread was no longer an isolated act of desperation. It was part of a pattern of deceit. The Thompsons were cheats and thieves. He showed the ledger to anyone who would look. "See, it's in their blood. He died owing me a fortune. And she finished the job by stealing from my store, and now she's living like a queen on Blackwood's money." The narrative was powerful because it absolved the town of its guilt. Naomi wasn't a desperate mother. She was a criminal. Her hanging would have been justice. The whispers finally reached the ranch, carried by a young hand who'd gone into town for supplies. He reported it directly to Silas, his face grim. "They're saying terrible things, boss, about you and about Mrs. Thompson. Cain is showing around some old ledger, saying her husband died in his debt." A dangerous light flickered in Silas's stormy eyes. He dismissed the ranch hand and went to find Naomi. She was in the study showing Sarah how to write her name. He waited until the girl had left, then closed the door. "I need to ask you something, Naomi," he said, dropping the formal Mrs. Thompson. "Your husband David, when he died, did he have any outstanding debts?" Naomi looked up, startled. "Debts? No. David was a careful man. He hated owing anyone anything. Why, Jedediah Cain is telling the town David died, owing him a significant sum," Silas said, watching her face. "He's using it as proof that you come from a family of thieves." Naomi's face went white. "That's a lie," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fierce anger. David took a loan from Cain for equipment, but he paid it off. I know he did. He sold his father's gold watch to make the last payment. He came home and told me, "We're free of him, Ellie. We're finally free." She stood, her hands clenched into fists. Cain is lying. David paid him. He wouldn't rest easy in his grave, knowing people thought him a debtor. Silas saw the unshakable conviction in her eyes. She was telling the truth, which meant Cain was not. This wasn't about a debt. It was about revenge. Cain was trying to destroy her, and by extension, him. "He's trying to turn the town against us," Silas said grimly. "He's talking to the sheriff about the children's welfare." The color drained from Naomi's face again, replaced by a primal fear. "My children. He wouldn't dare. He's a cornered animal, Naomi. He will try to tear down everything we have built here." In that moment, the lines of their strange, sterile contract vanished. They were no longer two separate entities bound by a business arrangement. They were allies, partners in a battle for the family they had accidentally started to become. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Silas looked at her, at the fear and defiance warring in her eyes. He saw not the victim from the gallows, but the woman of immense strength her husband had known. "We will not hide," he said, his voice like iron. "We will not let him control this story. Tomorrow we ride into town, all of us, and we will face him together." The morning air was cool as two wagons from the Blackwood Ranch cut a path toward Redemption Gulch. Silas drove the lead wagon, Naomi sitting ramrod straight beside him. She felt the stares of her 7 children, behind her their silence, a heavy blanket of trust she was terrified to tear. The second wagon carried 4 of Silas's most stoic ranch hands. This was not an invasion, it was an answer. Their arrival silenced the town's dusty main street. Faces peered from behind grubby window panes, and the saloon doors stopped swinging. The procession, the phantom rancher, the woman he'd plucked from the gallows, and her 7 children, a living testament to her alleged crime, was a spectacle that defied all rumor. It was stark, undeniable reality. Silas pulled the horses to a stop before the grand facade of Cain's Mercantile. He made no move to dismount. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze a physical weight on the shop's door. He had brought the battle to Cain's ground, and now he would force the man to show himself. A tense minute passed before the door swung open. Jedediah Cain stepped out. Sheriff Brody trailing him like a shadow. A mask of smug certainty was plastered on Cain's face. He clearly believed they had come to surrender to his campaign of slander. "Well, well, Blackwood," Cain's voice boomed thick with false welcome. "What an unexpected surprise. Have you finally come to your senses, ready to admit you've taken a viper to your bosom?" He brandished his ledger like a weapon. "The truth is, in this book, the Thompson name means debt and deceit." Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably. "Silas, perhaps this discussion is better had in my office. No need for a public scene." "The accusations were public, Sheriff," Silas stated, his voice cutting through the air. "The answer will be as well." He rose to his full height in the wagon, a towering figure looking down on the 2 men. "You claim my wife's late husband, David Thompson, died in your debt." The words struck the crowd like a physical blow. My wife. He had crossed an unspoken line, dissolving their cold contract in a single protective claim. Naomi's breath caught. It was a strategic lie, but it felt like the deepest truth, a shield raised against the town's scorn. "Your wife," Cain barked a derisive laugh, Putting a ring on that tramp doesn't wash away the ink in this book. Let's talk about the ink, Mr. Cain," Naomi said, her voice sharp and clear as she stood beside Silas. She was no longer the woman from the gallows. She was a wife defending her husband, a mother protecting her young. A murmur of surprise rippled through the onlookers. "My husband paid you every cent," she declared, her gaze boring into Cain's. "He sold his father's gold pocket watch to settle the debt. It was a beautiful timepiece with an eagle engraved on the back. Surely you remember such a fine piece of gold, Mr. Haho." "Cain." A muscle jumped in Cain's jaw. "I recall no such trinket. If my ledger doesn't say it's paid, it wasn't paid. A ledger is only as honest as the man who keeps it." Silas interjected, his voice smooth as polished stone. From the edge of the crowd, a frail voice spoke up. "I remember that watch." Old Mr. Abernathy, the watchmaker, stepped forward, leaning on his cane. "David Thompson brought it for a cleaning before he sold it. A fine piece. Had an eagle engraved on the case and the initials E.T. for his father, Elias Thompson." Cain's confident sneer began to dissolve. "That's hearsay. It proves nothing." "Then let's discuss another matter," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "Let's talk about the debt you owe, the one to the families of the men who died in your mine." A deathly hush descended. This was not about ledgers. This was about headstones. It was a wound every family in Redemption Gulch shared. "A tragic accident," Cain blustered, sweat beading on his brow. "The ground was unstable, was it?" Silas countered. "Or did you refuse to pay for proper timber supports?" "My mining engineer surveyed my land last year. He said the rock here is like rotten fruit. He said any man who sank a shaft without reinforcing it every 10 feet with solid oak wasn't a mine boss, but a grave digger." He swept his gaze over the crowd, letting the accusation settle. "How many of you received a single dollar from Mr. Cain after your husbands, sons, and brothers were buried under his mountain? He called it an act of God. But God doesn't profit by cutting corners on safety." The crowd's mood shifted, turning dark and violent. The animosity toward Naomi vanished, replaced by a focused, long-simmering rage directed at the man who had grown rich while they had grown poorer in every way that mattered. "My David told me." Naomi's voice rang out, filled with the clarity of grief. "The week before he died, he told me the support timbers were groaning. He begged you, Mr. Cain. He begged you to shut down the shaft for 1 week to replace them." "What was your answer?" Cain was ashen, his eyes darting frantically. "Lies, all of it." "What did you tell him, Cain?" Silas's voice was a whip crack. "He said..." Naomi's voice trembled with righteous fury. "He said the ore was too rich to stop. He said any man too scared to go down was a coward and could find work elsewhere." That was the breaking point. A massive, grizzled miner named Thomas, who had lost a brother alongside David, lunged forward with a grief-stricken roar. "You murdering bastard." "My brother wasn't a coward." Sheriff Brody and the Blackwood men moved to intercept him, but the dam of civility had burst. The crowd surged, their faces contorted with fury. They no longer saw a pillar of the community. They saw the man who had sent their loved ones to their deaths, the man who had then tried to hang a widow for a loaf of bread. His own avarice had forced her to steal. "This isn't justice," Cain shrieked, stumbling backward toward his store. "It's a lynch mob. "No, Cain," Sheriff Brody said, his voice heavy with a disgust that was years overdue. He finally saw the man he'd protected for what he was. "This is a reckoning." He turned to Silas. "Get your family out of here. I'll handle this." Silas gave a single, sharp nod. He helped Naomi back to her seat, took the reins and turned the wagon without a backward glance at the chaos consuming the mercantile. They rode in silence until the sounds of the angry town faded behind them. On the open plains under a vast and indifferent sky, Naomi turned to him. "You called me your wife?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas stared at the horizon. "It felt necessary." "And the children, making them your heirs, was that necessary too?" He pulled the wagon to a stop and turned on the seat to face her. The emptiness in his eyes was still there, but now it had depth like a dry well that remembered the taste of rain. "I came to town that day for a prize bull, Naomi." He confessed, his voice rough with unshed grief. "That's all. I heard the gossip about the hanging and rode over. Then I saw you, and all I could see was my Mary and the ferocity with which she would have fought for our son. I saw her strength in you. In that moment, saving you wasn't about you or me. It was about proving that a world that would hang a woman like you was a world I refused to live in." He dropped his gaze, a gesture of profound vulnerability. "The contract was a coward's bargain, a way to have life around me without risking my heart again. I was wrong. What comes next isn't about that contract. It's your choice." Naomi looked at her children, their hopeful faces turned toward her. She looked at this powerful, broken man who had offered her a gilded cage but had given her a fortress instead. He had stood for her. He had saved her twice. They were two solitary souls, shipwrecked by tragedy. But here on this empty plain, they could choose to build a new world together. A genuine smile, the first in years, touched her lips. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, "a house with 7 children needs a mother and a father, not a mistress and a landlord. It seems to me the roles are filled. We just need to start living them." For the first time since she had met him, a slow, hesitant smile reached Silas's eyes, chasing the last of the storms away. It was a fragile dawn, but it was a dawn. He picked up the reins and with a gentle cluck to the horses, started the long ride home. No longer to a ranch or a house, but to a future. The story of Naomi Thompson and Silas Blackwood is a powerful reminder that justice in the Old West wasn't always found in a sheriff's badge or a courtroom. Sometimes it was forged in the hearts of ordinary people pushed to extraordinary limits. Their journey shows us that the deepest wounds can sometimes create the most fertile ground for new life and love to grow, and that a true family isn't always born of blood, but built from shared burdens and fierce loyalty. It reminds us that even in the harshest of landscapes, redemption can be found not in a town's name, but in a single act of courage. If this story of desperation, justice, and unexpected love moved you, please show your support by giving this video a like and sharing it with someone who appreciates a powerful drama. Subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the Old West. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.